whatever we agree or not agree on, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is one of the crucial, but also one of the more complex issues which social scientists haven't come to grips with as of yet. So we can only learn more about this by either going back to the basics and test and question those who are philosophing and researching at a more at those more theoretical and philosophical levels, or looking at what's happening in reality and see glimpses, elements which could be identified as potential avenues for and lines of exploration for what you could call empowerment and participation. Now, one example I'd like to take, in which I've been involved myself, is, as you probably all know, the so-called two-stage World Summit on the Information Society. It was an UN-based kind of exercise hosted by or coordinated by the ITU. One part took place in Geneva, the last wing, the last part in Tunis. And of course, if you read the declaration and what was the outcome of this discussion, it's a lot of, much of the same, so to speak. A lot of the recommendations made were not mind-boggling, but there were openings created, elements which slipped into the discussion, which opened, so to speak, a space for new ways of looking at these issues. It was also the first major global conference which allowed the so-called civil society, the NGOs, and not officially represented organizations, to have sit at the same level as the private and the public authorities were. And it had the potential, I'm not saying it had as a result, but the potential, and it's definitely going to be explored further in the new configurations at other conferences. It had the potential to bring all of us involved in these debates to the table at the more democratic, at a more equal level. And that, of course, is a process. That's not an end product in itself. The end product may not be there where we would like it to be, but the process to reach that kind of end is equally important, in my opinion. So without saying we have moved a substantial way away from the more traditional perspectives, there is definitely a lot of experimenting going on, both in theory as well as in everyday practice. And I used the example at an international level, but there are definitely more examples to be given at the local levels. And one of the fair critiques at those local levels is definitely also the one which says participatory models are only good at analyzing localized community level kind of exercises, but they can't reach can't be upscaled to a more national level. I tend to question that, and in particular cases, I think there are enough good arguments to see the results also at national levels. But okay, as I highlighted in my paper, it needs all the factors, all the contextual elements to be taken into consideration as well. The question about interdisciplinarity, in a very straightforward way, I think that anthropology is one of the disciplines which has a lot to teach us, especially if we want to experiment and learn more about participatory communication processes and ethnographic kind of exercises. In other words, if we want to move away from a pure counting to a more qualitative approach and understanding of reality, then we can borrow from ethnographic and anthropological approaches. But at the same time, I would continue highlighting the importance of sociology and political economy, because it's still the structure of what the power and the status of societies are about. When you look at more hands-on kind of approaches, then education and social work, community studies could play a role. And in order to wrap it up, the link to environmental studies is definitely also on the agenda. And to answer Oliver's question about global warming, may I remind us that the move towards a more alternative way of looking at development and social change, especially in Europe, was the first result of it was thanks to what was called in those days the Green Movement or the Green Parties, and they emerged somewhere in the 70s, early 80s, as an alternative, as a questioning of the mainstream kind of policy. So it's not something which is part of our recent discussion. It has been part of the emergence of that new perspective at all. And to put it in another kind of cultural framework, many religions, many philosophical perspectives, they emphasize that we as human beings should live in harmony with nature, and that's definitely a challenge we have to face with global warming, not only ahead of us, but all over us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, the first question I understood from the female section is somehow, how do we know that we change so many thousands of years, things have been the same? The question is, or it was a response to my thesis that social change is how we think things are changing. Well, I think change is somehow a principle of life, and change is a principle, of course, of society, even if we still are always confronted with the same question, which is the sense of life. It is somehow the destination of human being to be undefined. And the only instrument and the only possibility to find some definition of what we are and why we are and what sense it makes what we do is communication. We have, I say it again, we have no other protocol. And by communication, we are changing what we experience. And the cultural theory has a lot of answers to that in the cultural history. Let me just line out one.